When a respected lawyer, Kevin Marshall, is wrongfully removed from a flight, it sparks a journey that transcends personal injustice. Wings of Justice follows Kevin as he fights not just for his own name, but for systemic change in an industry resistant to accountability. Facing courtroom drama, public scrutiny, and unlikely allies, Kevin's battle turns into a movement that challenges norms and reshapes policies. Will Kevin's fight lead to true reform, or will it be silenced by those who protect the status quo? If stories of courage and justice inspire you, comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to join us for this powerful story and more tales that ignite change. Dive in now and witness Kevin's journey from quiet defiance to the heart of a movement. Kevin Marshall was no stranger to high stakes. The airport buzzed around him, a chaotic mix of travelers brushing past each other, families reuniting, and the dull background hum of announcements. Today, Kevin walked through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with purpose. The worn leather of his briefcase, a testament to years of battles fought and won, bumped against his leg as he navigated toward Gate C. 22. He adjusted his tie, the crisp navy blue popping against the stark white of his shirt. His eyes, sharp with determination, scanned the departures board out of habit. Flight 317 to New York City, on time. Kevin's mind was a carousel of legal jargon and strategies for his upcoming case. This was not just any trial, but a high-profile class action suit involving labor rights and wage theft. Winning this case would bolster the voices of thousands and solidify his name in legal history. He felt the weight of expectation pressing on him, but welcomed it. This was what he had trained for his entire career. As he approached the gate, he noticed a group of airline staff standing near the boarding door. Among them was a gate attendant with weary eyes and a name tag that read S. Patel. Next to her, two flight attendants conversed in low tones, casting occasional glances at the gathering crowd. One of them, a woman with auburn hair tied in a tight bun, locked eyes with Kevin for a brief moment before looking away. He felt a prickle of awareness crawl up his spine, but shrugged it off. Boarding for Flight 317 to New York City will begin shortly, the overhead speaker announced, crackling slightly. Kevin checked his phone for last-minute emails, skimming through a message from his associate, Darren Lewis, about final details for the case. He tapped out a quick response and pocketed his phone as the first boarding group was called. Kevin moved forward when first-class passengers were invited to board. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate attendant, he felt the subtle shift in atmosphere, a shared, unspoken awareness that he was being scrutinized. Patel scanned his pass, eyes flicking up to meet his for a split second before moving on. "Thank you, Mr. Marshall," she said with professional detachment, her smile thin. The feeling that had tickled at the edges of Kevin's awareness grew stronger as he stepped onto the plane. The cabin was crisp and cool, its neutral tones and polished metal surfaces reflecting the early afternoon light. He nodded to an attendant who stood by the entrance and moved to his seat, 2A, by the window. The leather creaked as he settled in, and the faint scent of antiseptic and jet fuel mixed in the air. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. As he read, the murmur of other passengers boarding faded into white noise. But his focus was broken when he noticed a man, a wiry, silver-haired figure in a rumpled polo shirt, pause by his seat and stare for a beat too long before moving on. Kevin's jaw tightened reflexively. He was used to those moments, the quick assessments that happened in the blink of an eye, yet spoke volumes. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Charles Bennett," a voice rang out over the speakers as the cabin doors were being closed. Kevin glanced up, catching sight of the captain himself. Bennett stood at the front of the first-class cabin, hands behind his back, posture as rigid as his gaze was steady. He wore his years like armor, each line on his face a testament to decades of control and command. Kevin's eyes met Bennett's, and for a moment there was a spark, an unspoken challenge. It passed, and Bennett shifted his focus to deliver the routine safety speech. Kevin returned to his notes, the rustle of passengers adjusting in their seats filling the cabin. Minutes later, As the plane prepared for taxiing, a commotion broke out near the front. An older man, the same one who had scrutinized Kevin earlier, was now talking animatedly to a flight attendant. His voice, though muffled, carried an unmistakable tone of urgency. Kevin watched as the attendant's eyes darted to him, then back to the passenger. The captain, summoned by a discreet signal, approached with a look that promised resolve. "Sir, I need you to step off the plane," Captain Bennett said as he stopped in front of Kevin's seat. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Conversations dropped off into silence, replaced by the low whir of the plane's air circulation. Kevin blinked, his pulse spiking with confusion and anger. "Excuse me? I've been sitting here quietly since I boarded," he said, each word carefully measured to avoid escalation. "We've received a report that you may pose a disruption. This is a precaution," Bennett stated, the edge of finality in his tone, brooking no argument. Kevin glanced around the cabin, taking in the sidelong glances, the diverted eyes. He could almost hear the unspoken questions and judgments. The familiar chill of injustice settled in his gut. "There's been a misunderstanding," Kevin said, his voice unwavering. "I'm simply preparing for a case. There's no cause for alarm." "It's not up for discussion, sir," Bennett repeated, louder this time, ensuring the statement landed in the ears of nearby passengers. The moment stretched, taut and sharp, until Kevin knew resisting would only serve to amplify the spectacle. With a controlled exhale, he gathered his papers, placed them back into his briefcase, and stood. As he walked down the aisle, past passengers who avoided his gaze or watched with a mix of pity and curiosity. The weight of humiliation pressed down on him. The plane door closed behind him, sealing him out of the cabin, out of the place he had paid to be. Kevin stood on the jet bridge, the sterile blue carpeting under his polished shoes, feeling almost surreal. He looked back at the plane, its nose pointed arrogantly toward the open runway. The hum of engines was a mocking symphony. He walked into the terminal, aware of the eyes that followed him there too, and found an empty seat by a wide window. The sun outside had shifted, casting long golden beams that made the tarmac shimmer. He felt the bile of anger and shame rise, but forced himself to steady his breathing. This was bigger than the discomfort of a single man being shown the door. This was a lifetime of moments woven together by the thread of unwarranted suspicion and silent judgment. His phone buzzed, startling him. A video had already been uploaded online, the title catching his eye. "Lawyer removed from plane. Racial bias alleged?" The video was only a minute long, but its impact was immediate. Hundreds of comments flooded in, a maelstrom of outrage, defense, and calls for action. Kevin's pulse steadied, not out of calm, but a hardening resolve. This fight had come to him, uninvited, but inevitable, and he would not back down. Kevin sat at the edge of the molded plastic chair, eyes fixed on the runway beyond the wide terminal window. Jets thundered in the distance, lifting effortlessly into the sky, while he sat grounded, robbed of movement and dignity. The muffled background of airport announcements and nearby conversations blurred into an indistinct hum. His phone vibrated again, the notification light blinking urgently. He unlocked it to find dozens of messages, some from friends who had seen the video, others from colleagues who had been alerted by the unfolding news. But one message stood out, a text from Rachel Stevens, a journalist he knew from previous legal exposés. "Kevin just saw the footage. This is significant. We need to talk ASAP." Kevin's thumb hovered over the call button. Rachel had a reputation for hard-hitting stories that didn't just report injustices, but catalyzed change. Before he could reconsider, he pressed call. "Kevin!" Rachel's voice was sharp, focused. "I'm at the office. This story has legs, and it's already spreading. Are you ready to take this public fully?" Kevin's breath caught in his chest. He felt the weight of the choice before him, to fight back or let the moment pass, becoming just another anecdote buried in the daily churn of online outrage. "I am," he said, the certainty in his voice surprising even him. "This can't be swept under the rug." "Good. I'll set up an interview. We'll start with the facts and build from there. You're not just a headline, Kevin. You're the first chapter of a bigger story." As evening fell, Kevin found himself in his small home office. The familiar surroundings, shelves lined with legal books, framed photos of past victories, and awards that once filled him with pride, felt different now, more like evidence of the battles fought than accolades. He stared at his computer screen, where the video continued to rack up views. The comment section was alive with anger, empathy, and debate. This is what systemic bias looks like. Another overreaction? Or something more? Scrolling, Kevin's eyes stilled on one comment. As a former airline employee, I've seen this happen too many times. It needs to stop. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Darren Lewis, his colleague and friend, stood at the threshold, his brow furrowed with concern. Darren was a tall, broad-shouldered man who wore suits as comfortably as he did baseball caps. Today, it was the latter. His casual attire a sign that he came as a friend, not an associate. "Hey," Darren said, stepping inside. "I saw the video. How are you holding up?" Kevin offered a thin smile. "I've been better." Darren's eyes were serious as he took a seat across from Kevin. "You know they'll come at you hard for this, right? The airline will protect itself at all costs." "I know," Kevin said, the weight of Darren's words pressing down on him. "But we can't let them control the narrative." "You're right." Darren nodded, the flicker of a smile breaking his stern expression. "You've always been good at turning a loss into a win. Let's make this one count." The next day, Kevin sat in the brightly lit office of the Daily Chronicle, Rachel Stevens' workplace. The glass walls and bustling newsroom hummed with energy. Rachel, a woman in her mid-30s with a sharp bob and eyes that missed nothing, leaned forward from her desk, recording device poised. "Let's start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me what happened in your own words." Kevin took a breath, recounting every detail. The sidelong glances, Captain Bennett's tone, the way judgment had been passed on him before a single word was spoken in his defense. His voice steadied as he spoke, each memory becoming a stepping stone across a river of doubt and indignation. "And what was going through your mind when you were asked to leave?" Rachel asked, her pen pausing mid-air. "I thought about the countless others who've faced similar treatment, who've had their dignity questioned, their character judged without a chance to explain. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who's been made to feel like they don't belong," Kevin said, the fire of conviction sharpening his words. Rachel nodded, eyes narrowing as she connected his statement to a broader truth. "This story will be more than just your experience, Kevin. It'll be a look at a culture that allows moments like this to keep happening." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Kevin replied. Hours after the interview was published, Kevin received a call from Jonathan Perry, his mentor and one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the state. "Kevin, I read Rachel's article. The story's powerful, but you need to be prepared. The airline's legal team won't sit idle. They'll launch their defense, and it'll be ruthless," Jonathan said, his voice low and grave. Kevin stood by the window, watching the street below as headlights streaked across the dark pavement. "I know, Jonathan. I'm ready to fight this." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jonathan spoke again, this time with a note of pride. "Good, because I'll be fighting with you." As the evening news flickered on the screen behind him, Kevin saw the airline's CEO addressing reporters. The words were expected. "We prioritize passenger safety and adhere to protocol." But they stung all the same. The statement ended with a promise of an internal review, a phrase Kevin had heard too many times before, to believe without skepticism. The days following the interview were a whirlwind. Kevin found himself thrust into the spotlight, his phone ringing with calls from local news stations, civil rights organizations, and individuals sharing their own stories of unjust treatment. The office, once a place of relative solitude, became a hive of activity, papers strewn across his desk like battle plans. Rachel Stevens' article titled, "A Flight Interrupted, One Lawyer's Stand Against Bias," was shared thousands of times within hours. It was no longer just Kevin's story, it was a rallying cry. Kevin's inbox pinged, a new email catching his eye. It was from Thomas Walker, an airline employee who had read the article. It read, "Mr. Marshall, I worked for the airline for over 20 years before retiring. I've witnessed firsthand how certain passengers are targeted unfairly. If you're willing to listen, I have information that could help." The email was short, but the implications were enormous. Kevin replied immediately, arranging a call with Thomas. The veteran employee's insights could be a crucial piece in the puzzle, offering evidence that Kevin's case was not isolated but part of a larger, troubling pattern. Across town in the boardroom of the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Executives sat around a long mahogany table, their expressions ranging from worried to furious. At the head of the table, CEO James Lancaster tapped a pen against a folder marked Internal Review. "We need to contain this," Lancaster said, eyes scanning the room. "This Marshall case is stirring up more attention than we anticipated." Captain Charles Bennett, who had been placed on administrative leave, sat silently in a corner, his jaw clenched. The decision to ground him had come swiftly after the video surfaced, but he wore it with a mix of anger and disbelief. He believed he had acted within protocol, yet doubt was beginning to take root. One of the airline's senior lawyers, Evelyn Carter, spoke up. "Our stance remains that Captain Bennett acted based on a credible passenger report. We need to reinforce that narrative." Lancaster nodded but frowned. "And we need more than just a defensive position. Find any weaknesses in Marshall's case and exploit them." Meanwhile, Kevin met Thomas Walker in a quiet cafe, choosing a corner table away from prying ears. Thomas was an older man, his face marked by years of hard work and the kind of worry that etched itself into permanent lines. "I won't lie, Kevin. Talking to you is risky, but it's the right thing to do," Thomas began, his voice steady but cautious. "I've seen how people like Captain Bennett operate, quick to pull the trigger when it comes to disruptive passengers, which more often than not translates to anyone who looks out of place." Kevin listened intently, nodding as Thomas recounted instances where passengers were singled out and removed for reasons that were flimsy at best. "I have some old incident reports," Thomas continued. "Nothing damning on its own, but together they paint a picture." "Every piece counts," Kevin said, his determination hardening into resolve. "This isn't just about my case anymore. It's about making sure no one else goes through this." Rachel published a follow-up article that included anonymous testimonies from airline employees corroborating Kevin's claims. The piece detailed a troubling pattern of selective passenger treatment and vague safety protocols that left room for individual biases. The public response was immediate. Protests organized by civil rights groups popped up outside the airline's corporate office. Signs read, "Bias takes flight," and "Justice for all passengers." Social media amplified the movement, with hashtags like #FlyFair and #NoBiasInTheSkies trending. But with the surge of support came the backlash. Anonymous messages flooded Kevin's inbox, some accusing him of playing the victim or exaggerating the event. One email stood out, its words simple yet chilling. "Drop this case if you know what's good for you." Kevin showed the message to Darren, who read it, his face darkening. "We need to take this seriously, Kevin. They're trying to intimidate you." "I won't be silenced," Kevin said, though the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightened. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. The airline released a polished video statement, fronted by a calm-voiced PR representative. "At Airline Name, passenger safety is our highest priority. We are deeply committed to ensuring that our procedures are fair and impartial. We respect Mr. Marshall's concerns and are conducting a thorough internal review." Kevin watched the statement with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The language was diplomatic, carefully avoiding admissions of fault while emphasizing their commitment to fairness. It was clear. They were preparing for a fight, not an apology. Rachel called soon after the statement aired. "They're playing it safe, but that only works if the public loses interest. We need to keep this story alive." "I agree," Kevin said, his fingers drumming against his desk. "It's time to show them that this case is about more than one flight. It's about every instance of unchecked bias." Jonathan Perry sat across from Kevin, a thick folder in front of him. His glasses caught the light as he flipped through pages of evidence and testimonies. "We need to build this case from multiple angles. Your experience, supporting incidents, and expert testimony on systemic bias, Jonathan said. This can't just be an emotional plea. It needs to be irrefutable. Kevin nodded, feeling the pulse of the moment. Thomas Walker's reports are a start, and Rachel has been digging up more witnesses. Jonathan's eyes sharpened. Good. We'll need every piece to prove this isn't just an isolated incident. The meeting continued into the night, filled with strategies, notes, and a shared sense of determination. For Kevin, the room felt less like an office and more like a war room, a place where change was being drafted, battle by battle. The hum of conversation in the crowded community center was punctuated by the creak of folding chairs and the soft rustle of paper as people settled into their seats. Kevin stood at the front, flanked by posters reading "Equal Treatment for All" and "Stop Discrimination in the Skies." Rachel stood off to the side, notepad in hand, ready to document the evening. The crowd was a mix: local activists, fellow lawyers, community leaders, and those who had felt the sting of discrimination in their own lives. Kevin scanned the room, catching glimpses of hope and frustration in equal measure. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Kevin began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "This case isn't just about what happened to me. It's about challenging a system that has allowed bias to persist unchecked." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. A young woman raised her hand. "Mr. Marshall, I used to work at the airport. I saw things too. Passengers removed without clear reasons. What can we do to support your case?" Kevin nodded, heartened by her courage. "Sharing your experiences helps strengthen this fight. Rachel here is collecting testimonies to show that this isn't isolated but part of a broader issue. Stand with us, speak out, and stay vocal on social platforms. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to ignore us." Rachel stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "The stories we gather today will put pressure on the airline and others like it. It's about changing the narrative." As the meeting wrapped up, Kevin felt a renewed surge of energy. The room's atmosphere buzzed with determination, a collective refusal to let the status quo remain unchallenged. As people filed out, a man with salt and pepper hair approached. "I'm Mark, a retired pilot," he said, shaking Kevin's hand firmly. "I've seen both sides of this, and it's time someone stood up. If you need an expert to speak to safety procedures and how they're sometimes misused, I'm your guy." Kevin's pulse quickened. This was the kind of ally they needed. "Thank you, Mark. Your insight could be invaluable." In the boardroom at the airline's headquarters, Evelyn Carter, the airline's lead attorney, paced the room as she addressed the gathered team. The walls were lined with charts and notes outlining their defensive strategy. "We need to discredit the emotional angle and redirect the narrative to safety," Evelyn said. "The public can forgive a lot in the name of safety, even if it means accepting hard decisions." Captain Bennett sat at the end of the table, arms crossed and eyes fixed on a point just above her head. His presence was quieter now, the bluster of his confidence subdued after days of suspension and growing public criticism. "What about the pilot's statement?" one executive asked, glancing nervously at Bennett. "We stand by his decision as protocol," Evelyn continued, "but we need to emphasize that the process, not personal judgment, led to Mr. Marshall's removal." The meeting concluded with a stark reality. The airline was committed to protecting itself, even if it meant subtly shifting the blame away from the company and onto Bennett as an individual. Evelyn caught Bennett's eye as the room emptied. He offered her a thin, tired smile before turning and leaving. Back at the Daily Chronicle, Rachel sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paper and glowing computer screens. The testimonies she had collected over the past few weeks painted a troubling picture. Incidents where passengers of color were disproportionately flagged for disruptive behavior and removed from flights. An intern approached, holding a folder. "Rachel, I found this while combing through old flight logs from public records. It shows that on Captain Bennett's flights, there's a higher-than-average rate of passenger removals for safety concerns." Rachel's eyes widened as she flipped through the data. It was subtle enough to escape casual notice, but damning when connected to broader patterns. This was the breakthrough they needed. "That's it," she whispered, already reaching for her phone to call Kevin. When he answered, she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "Rachel, what's up?" "I've got it. Data that shows a pattern on Bennett's flights. It's not just you, Kevin. This could be the thread that unravels their defense." Kevin felt a spark reignite. "Email me everything. This changes the game." In the days leading up to the trial, Kevin's office became a revolving door of activity. Darren was there late into the night, reviewing the newest documents Rachel had uncovered. Jonathan Perry worked tirelessly, making calls to secure expert witnesses like Marka, the retired pilot who could testify about how safety protocols were applied and misapplied. Kevin felt the strain seep into his bones, each hour marked by a new decision or a last-minute addition to their evidence list. But as he looked out the window at the cityscape, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, he knew this was bigger than him. It was about correcting a course that had gone unchecked for too long. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Rachel stepped in, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "They're doubling down on their safety-first argument," she said. "Evelyn Carter has been all over the news, emphasizing the importance of following protocol." Kevin's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we'll show that protocol was just a smokescreen." "We're ready." Kevin's name had become synonymous with the broader conversation on racial bias and systemic injustice. The streets outside his office saw peaceful protests organized by local advocacy groups. Signs held high with messages like "Equality in every seat" and "Stop the bias." Rachel's latest article, "Patterns in the Skies: A Deeper Look at Airline Bias," resonated far beyond their city. It included testimonies from passengers who had reached out anonymously, sharing their experiences of being unfairly singled out during flights. The most impactful were those from other professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, who had been mistaken for threats instead of travelers. One day, Kevin's office phone rang, the display reading an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Marshall, this is Claire Nguyen, an attorney specializing in aviation law. I read about your case and wanted to offer insight. There's precedent that could support your argument, particularly cases involving misuse of safety protocols as a pretext." Kevin's pulse quickened. Claire's experience could add an invaluable dimension to their strategy. "Thank you, Miss Nguyen. Your input would be more than welcome." "Please call me Claire," she said warmly. "This is bigger than one case. Let's win this." Evenings at Kevin's home had taken on a different rhythm. The once comforting quiet was now punctuated by phone calls and video meetings. He stood by his kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, when his phone buzzed with a text from his sister, Trina. "I'm proud of you. Stay strong. Mom would be too." The message brought a tightness to his chest. Trina had always been his anchor, reminding him of where he came from and why he fought so hard. Memories of their mother, a fierce advocate in her own right, flooded back. She'd taught them that silence in the face of wrongdoing was a choice that spoke louder than words. He turned as Darren walked into the room, stacks of files in hand. "Sorry to crash your evening, but I found something interesting." Darren set down the papers with a grin. "Remember those flight logs Rachel got? I cross-referenced them with complaints filed by passengers, and guess what? More often than not, Captain Bennett's removals correlated with vague reports from specific repeat passengers, likely people inclined to report bias under the guise of safety concerns." Kevin's brows rose. "You're saying there's a pattern in who reports as well?" "Exactly. This could discredit the so-called safety justification." Kevin nodded, the puzzle pieces aligning in his mind. This was not just about Captain Bennett's actions, but about how an unchecked system allowed personal biases to gain institutional power. The next day, Mark, the retired pilot, met with Kevin and Jonathan in their office. The walls were lined with whiteboards scribbled with notes, legal precedents, and strategic questions. Mark sat forward in his chair, his hands clasped as he spoke. "When I was flying, the captain had significant discretion, yes, but there was always an unspoken understanding. Judgments weren't supposed to be clouded by personal beliefs. Protocols existed for genuine safety concerns, not for singling people out based on appearance." Jonathan leaned forward. Would you be willing to testify to that? Mark hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yes. It's time people knew that safety is often used as a catch-all excuse. Rachel entered the room with a triumphant smile. Good news, she announced. Claire and Nguyen agreed to join the case pro bono, and she's prepared to bring in examples from similar cases to show precedent. The room buzzed with energy. For the first time since the ordeal began, Kevin felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. They were going into this battle armed not just with facts, but with voices that had long been silenced. Evelyn Carter sat at her desk, a sleek glass structure that reflected the cityscape outside. The latest reports from her team were less promising than she'd hoped. The public opinion had shifted, and Kevin Marshall's case was gaining traction with influential voices supporting him. A junior associate entered, a stack of papers in hand. Ms. Carter, this is a compilation of new witness statements. They're leaning heavily into claims of systemic bias rather than just a one-off incident. Evelyn scanned the documents, her expression hardening. Then we need to pivot our approach. Emphasize our history of diversity initiatives. Highlight the cases where safety protocols were essential and justified. She glanced at the screen displaying a social media feed full of people demanding accountability. Despite the polished press releases and carefully managed optics, cracks were forming, and she knew it. Contact Captain Bennett, she added, her tone clipped. Make sure he's prepared for what's coming. That evening, Kevin called Rachel, needing to talk through the mounting pressure. The call connected, and he could hear the clatter of her keyboard in the background. Late night? He asked. Always, she said with a laugh that quickly sobered. I've been going through more anonymous stories. It's incredible how many people had similar experiences but never spoke up. I know, Kevin said, the gravity of those untold stories settling over him. It makes you wonder how many of them were just moments away from being what happened to me. Exactly, Rachel replied. But now, with people willing to share and the evidence we've gathered, we can turn this into something bigger. Systemic reform. Kevin leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of unity, of collective purpose. Let's make sure this fight isn't just for me, but for every story that's been buried. Count on it, Rachel said. As they ended the call, Kevin looked out at the night sky. The city lights flickered, a patchwork of resilience and hope. He knew that when the trial began, it would be more than just his story at stake. It would be the beginning of a reckoning that reached beyond the cabin of one flight, into the heart of an industry and beyond. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people filed into their seats. The gallery was packed with journalists, advocates, and onlookers eager to witness the case that had sparked national debate. The judge, Honorable Meredith Stone, a figure known for her fair but firm rulings, presided over the session. Her gavel struck once, cutting through the whispers and signaling the start of proceedings. Kevin sat next to Jonathan Perry, who exuded a calm confidence that steadied the room. Across the aisle, Evelyn Carter sat poised, her eyes unreadable as she sorted through her notes. Captain Bennett was present, his face a mask of composure, though the slight tension in his jaw betrayed a deeper unease. Jonathan rose, buttoning his suit jacket as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than one man's removal from a flight. It is about the systemic misuse of safety protocols that allowed personal biases to infringe upon basic human dignity. We will show that what happened to Kevin Marshall was not an isolated event, but a consequence of unchecked practices. Evelyn Carter followed, her tone measured, eyes shifting between the jury and Captain Bennett. This case is about the balance between ensuring passenger safety and maintaining fairness. Captain Bennett's actions were guided by protocol, designed to prioritize the well-being of all on board. Today, we will prove that his decision was justified under the circumstances. The trial moved swiftly into witness testimonies. The first witness was Linda Roberts, a fellow passenger from the flight. She described the incident with a voice that trembled slightly but held steady. I remember thinking it didn't make sense, she said, eyes darting nervously. Mr. Marshall was quiet, working on some papers. He didn't do anything disruptive. Jonathan nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. And did you see any behavior from Mr. Marshall that would warrant removal? No, not at all, she replied, her voice firmer this time. Evelyn's cross-examination was sharp, aimed at planting doubt. Mrs. Roberts, would you agree that you're not a trained safety officer? I would, but, Linda began, only for Evelyn to cut her off with a practiced smile. That's all? Thank you. Kevin glanced at Jonathan, who gave a reassuring nod. They had prepared for this line of questioning. The day Mark, the retired pilot, took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. Mark's reputation preceded him, lending credibility that could sway the jury. He spoke clearly, detailing the discretionary power given to captains and the standard practices that ensured such power wasn't misused. There's a fine line between safety and judgment based on perception, Mark said. The latter is where problems arise. Removing a passenger without concrete evidence of a threat undermines the principle of fair treatment. Evelyn rose for cross-examination, her expression cool. Mr. Hayes, would you say that, in some cases, erring on the side of caution is necessary? Mark met her gaze. In true cases of safety, yes. But caution shouldn't be a blanket defense for actions influenced by unconscious bias. The subtle shift in the jury's posture told Kevin that Mark's words had struck a chord. When Captain Bennett took the stand, tension coiled in the room. He described the situation on the day of the flight, detailing the report from a concerned passenger that had led to his decision. I assessed the information and followed procedure, Bennett said, his voice steady but lacking the conviction it once held. Jonathan leaned forward. Captain Bennett, are you aware of any instances where your decisions have disproportionately impacted passengers of certain backgrounds? Bennett hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. I can't recall specific instances, he said, his voice tight. Jonathan nodded, letting the silence stretch before continuing. But you were aware that the removal rate on your flights was higher than average, correct? I wasn't until recently, Bennett admitted, his composure cracking just slightly. The admission rippled through the courtroom. Rachel, sitting in the gallery, scribbled notes feverishly, knowing this was a key moment that could change the course of the trial. During a break, Rachel met with Kevin in the hallway. The tension of the trial hadn't dulled her sharp focus. Kevin, we need to push on the data we found about passenger complaints. The jury needs to understand that this isn't about one captain. It's about how these protocols are weaponized without oversight. Kevin nodded. Jonathan's going to bring it up during the closing arguments. Back in the courtroom, Evelyn called a final witness, a flight attendant who had been on duty that day. Her testimony painted a picture of a crew under stress, doing their best in difficult circumstances. It was clear Evelyn's goal was to frame the incident as a judgment call made under pressure, not malice. Jonathan presented the compiled data from Rachel's investigation, highlighting the disproportionately high removal rates under Captain Bennett compared to other pilots. He finished his presentation by addressing the jury directly. This is not just a statistical anomaly. It's a pattern, and in patterns, we find truth. Evelyn stood for her rebuttal, emphasizing the difficulty of being a pilot tasked with the safety of dozens of lives. Every decision made on a flight is a balance. Captain Bennett was faced with an immediate concern, and he chose caution. We ask the jury to understand that context. The day ended with a palpable tension in the air. The jury's expressions were unreadable, their thoughts hidden behind neutral gazes as they were dismissed for the day. The courtroom quieted as Kevin took the stand, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on him. He glanced at Jonathan, who gave a brief nod of encouragement before turning to the jury. Mr. Marshall, can you recount the moments leading up to your removal from Flight 317? Jonathan began, his voice steady, guiding. Kevin took a breath, his voice level but resonant. I boarded the flight, settled into my seat, and began reviewing documents for my upcoming case. I didn't speak to anyone except to thank the flight attendant who greeted me. Moments later, I was told I needed to leave. No explanation that made sense, just a vague accusation of being disruptive. The jury's eyes were on him, some leaning in, others frowning thoughtfully. Jonathan continued, And what went through your mind when you were asked to leave? Kevin hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because of the memories flooding back. It felt like every time I'd been judged unfairly, without cause, without my voice being heard. I wasn't just a passenger that day, I was a symbol of a larger, painful reality many people face. Evelyn rose for cross-examination, her gaze measured. "Mr. Marshall, do you understand that a captain must prioritize the safety of all passengers? That sometimes their actions, while unfortunate, may not always appear fair?" "I understand the importance of safety, Ms. Carter," Kevin responded, holding her gaze. "But safety without fairness becomes another form of control. That's what we're questioning today." A brief murmur rippled through the audience, silenced by a sharp glance from Judge Stone. Over the next few days, the trial shifted between technical testimonies and emotional appeals. Expert witnesses called by Jonathan spoke of unconscious bias and the way it could permeate decision-making. Even in structured environments like airline protocol, Dr. Samuel Reyes, a psychologist specializing in implicit bias, testified, "When authority figures make split-second decisions, those choices are often influenced by unconscious stereotypes. In a setting as stressful as an aircraft, these biases can manifest without the individual even realizing it." Evelyn Carter's cross-examination was incisive. "Dr. Reyes, can you definitively say that Captain Bennett's actions were influenced by bias?" Dr. Reyes shook his head. "No one can say that definitively without being inside Captain Bennett's mind. But what we can say is that statistical patterns and personal testimonies reveal the strong possibility of such biases at work." The jury, attentive and scribbling notes, showed subtle signs of shifting perspective. The day of closing arguments arrived, thick with anticipation. Jonathan stood, his expression serious, words chosen like the sharp edge of a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you've heard testimonies from passengers, experts, and even the airline itself. What we've seen is not just a moment of misjudgment, but a system that allows such moments to happen without question. Captain Bennett's decision reflects a broader issue, a practice hidden under the guise of safety, but influenced by unseen prejudices. Your decision today will echo far beyond these walls." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't just about Kevin Marshall. It's about ensuring that no one else boards a plane, wondering if they'll be next to stand accused without cause." Evelyn stood next, her tone sympathetic but firm. "The responsibility of a pilot is immense, and with it comes difficult decisions. Captain Bennett acted in what he believed to be the best interest of all passengers. We must not punish him for erring on the side of caution, a principle that has kept countless flights safe." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Stone dismissed the jury to deliberate. Kevin's heart pounded in his chest, each second stretching as if time itself had been set to pause. Kevin sat outside the courtroom, the polished benches lined with anxious faces. His legal team, friends, and members of advocacy groups who had shown their support throughout the trial. Rachel sat beside him, tapping her pen against her notepad in a staccato rhythm. "Any idea how long this could take?" she asked, her voice low. Kevin shook his head. "It could be hours, or it could be days." Darren approached, offering Kevin a coffee that had long since cooled. "You've done everything you can, man. Now it's out of our hands." Kevin managed a thin smile. "Out of our hands, but not out of our reach." The minutes turned into hours, the jury's deliberation stretching into the evening. The anticipation was palpable, an unspoken hum that filled the corridor. A rustle passed through the crowd as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Kevin's pulse quickened, every nerve alive with the knowledge that this moment would define not just the next few months, but possibly the rest of his life. "All rise!" the bailiff called, and Judge Stone took her seat. She nodded to the jury foreperson, who stood and unfolded a piece of paper. "In the matter of Kevin Marshall versus the airline, we find the defendant guilty of discriminatory conduct." A collective exhale swept the room, some relieved, others stunned into silence. Kevin's chest tightened with a rush of emotion, the triumph bittersweet against the backdrop of everything that had led to this point. Captain Bennett's face, for the first time, showed more than stoic detachment. There was a shadow of something like regret. Jonathan turned to Kevin, eyes glistening with victory. "You did it." Kevin nodded, tears pricking his eyes as the weight of the moment settled. He glanced over to Rachel, who gave him a thumbs up, her smile fierce. This was not just a win for him, but for everyone who had ever felt voiceless. Judge Stone's gavel struck, signaling the end of the proceedings, but Kevin knew this was only the beginning of a broader fight for systemic change. The courtroom emptied gradually, the low murmur of voices mingling with the shuffle of papers and the distant clatter of footsteps. Kevin stood at the center of a small cluster. Jonathan, Rachel, Darren, and other supporters who had come to witness the outcome. He exhaled, feeling both elation and exhaustion in equal measure. It was over, but the reverberations were only just beginning. Rachel leaned in, her notepad clutched in her hand. "Kevin, you did it! This will be the lead story everywhere by tonight." Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on Kevin's shoulder. "This isn't just a win, Kevin. This sets a precedent. It's a call for the industry to reconsider how it uses power." Across the courtroom, Captain Bennett remained seated, eyes fixed on the polished wooden table in front of him. For the first time, he looked diminished, the air of authority eroded by the weight of the verdict. Kevin watched him for a moment, a flicker of empathy breaking through. The case was never about vengeance, but about righting an ingrained wrong. As he gathered his things, the bailiff approached. "Mr. Marshall, there's a crowd outside waiting for a statement." Kevin nodded, adjusting his tie and preparing himself for what lay beyond the courthouse doors. He knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the first wave. The courthouse steps were a blur of camera flashes and the roar of reporters calling out questions. Kevin stepped into the cool evening air, his pulse quickening at the sight of dozens of supporters holding signs and chanting slogans of solidarity. At the front, a banner read, "Justice takes flight." He raised a hand to quiet the crowd. The moment the noise subsided, he spoke, voice clear and steady. "Today, a message has been sent, that fairness and dignity are not privileging, but rights. This victory isn't just for me. It's for everyone who has been judged before being known, silenced before being heard. But this is only the beginning." A cheer erupted, mingling with the bright flashes of cameras. Rachel, standing to the side, caught Kevin's eye and gave a nod of approval. The fight had made its way into headlines, but the real battle was ensuring it became more than just a fleeting story. The airline released an official statement within hours of the verdict. The words were careful, polished, yet lacking in substance. "We acknowledge the court's decision and are committed to reviewing our protocols to ensure fair treatment for all passengers. Safety and fairness remain our highest priorities." It was a gesture, Kevin knew, but only the first in what needed to be a series of substantive changes. Evelyn Carter, their lead attorney, was seen in news footage delivering a similar line, her professional poise intact, even in the wake of defeat. Kevin watched the coverage with Darren and Jonathan at his office. "They're hedging," Jonathan remarked. "They're acknowledging just enough to appear compliant, but not enough to commit to actual change." Darren folded his arms. "We need to keep the pressure on, make sure this doesn't fade away." Days after the verdict, Kevin received an unexpected message. "I'd like to talk." Charles Bennett. The name on the screen stilled him. A meeting with the man who had been the face of his ordeal was the last thing Kevin had anticipated. But curiosity and a sense of closure urged him to agree. They met in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and the noise of media attention. Bennett looked older than Kevin remembered from the trial, the lines on his face more pronounced. He met Kevin's gaze with an expression that was difficult to read. Part regret, part something more vulnerable. "I came here to apologize," Bennett said after a long pause. "I know that doesn't undo anything, but it's what I can offer." Kevin nodded slowly, measuring his response. "Acknowledgement is a start, Captain. But the system that allowed this to happen needs more than apologies." Bennett's eyes dropped to his hands, which clenched around the mug. "I didn't see it then, how ingrained some reactions were. I only saw protocol, not the person it affected." There was a silence, heavy but not hostile. Kevin saw a man struggling with the realization that his authority had been a part of something larger, something flawed. People can change, Kevin said, breaking the tension. But it takes more than realization. It takes action. Bennett nodded, a flicker of determination crossing his face. I intend to start. The airline, facing mounting public pressure, announced a new set of initiatives aimed at eliminating implicit bias in its procedures. Training programs were overhauled, and independent audits were promised to ensure fairness. Kevin watched the announcement on TV, the CEO delivering promises that, while scripted, held the potential for real impact. Rachel joined Kevin at his office, a triumphant grin on her face. They're calling it the Marshall Standard, she said, placing an article on his desk. The headline read, New Anti-Bias Guidelines Sweeping Through Airlines Following Landmark Case. Kevin traced the words with a finger, the weight of it sinking in. This was what they had fought for, not just vindication, but a step toward systemic change. It's just the start, Kevin said, looking up at Rachel. There's more to do, and we'll be here for it, Rachel said, her eyes sparking with determination. Kevin attended a panel at a legal conference weeks later, invited to speak about the implications of his case. The room was filled with young lawyers, activists, and industry professionals, their expressions a blend of respect and curiosity. What we achieved wasn't just a victory in a courtroom, Kevin began. It was a message that institutions must evolve, that fairness is not optional, and the real work is ensuring these changes take root. As he spoke, he spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Darren, Jonathan, and even Mark, the retired pilot who had taken the stand. The fight had brought together a coalition of voices, each crucial to moving the needle toward justice. After the event, a young law student approached him. Mr. Marshall, your case inspired me to focus on civil rights law. I just wanted to say thank you. Kevin smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. Keep fighting, he said. The world needs more voices willing to challenge what's wrong. As he walked out into the crisp night air, the city lights glistening like a promise, Kevin felt a weight lift. The battle had changed him, scarred him in some ways, but it had also reinforced the ideals that led him into law in the first place. It was a long fight, but one he would choose over and over again. The news of the Marshall Standard swept across industries, not just within aviation, but across sectors grappling with similar issues. Other airlines began adopting similar policies, hiring consultants specializing in diversity and inclusion, and pledging transparency in their handling of passenger complaints. Kevin watched the developments with a cautious optimism. Change was happening, but sustaining it would require vigilance. One evening, Kevin met with Jonathan and Darren in their office. Their table littered with newspaper clippings and draft proposals for future initiatives. A headline caught Kevin's eye. Railways and public transport consider anti-bias measures inspired by Marshall Standard. Jonathan leaned back, a rare smile creasing his features. This is more than we hoped for when we started. Darren chuckled, though his eyes held a note of seriousness. We aim to win a case. Now we're watching an entire conversation shift. But you know they'll be looking for ways to water it down, right? Kevin nodded, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on him. Then we make sure they don't. Rachel's follow-up articles chronicled the tangible impacts of the Marshall Standard. She interviewed passengers who shared stories of being treated fairly on recent flights, attributing the changes to the public outcry and Kevin's case. The pieces served as both celebration and reminder that vigilance was key to keeping reforms meaningful. One story stood out. A mother who had been hesitant to fly with her teenage son, citing past instances of profiling. After the new policies were enacted, they flew cross-country without issue. Her words stuck with Kevin. It felt different, safer. Like we were seen for who we are, not what someone feared we might be. Kevin read the story alone in his office, the glow of his computer screens the only light. It wasn't just validation, it was proof that the fight mattered beyond courtroom walls. Trina visited Kevin at home one afternoon, bringing over a casserole she insisted he needed after weeks of surviving on takeout. The two sat on his small balcony, the city skyline a jagged line against the pink hues of the setting sun. I read Rachel's last article, Trina said, breaking the comfortable silence. It's amazing how far this has come. Kevin took a sip of his iced tea, nodding. It is, but it's also overwhelming. I keep thinking about how much more needs to be done. Trina placed her hand over his. Kevin, you've lit a fire. That's more than most people get to do in a lifetime. They sat quietly for a moment before Trina added, Mom would be proud, you know. Kevin's throat tightened, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He looked out at the city lights, blinking against the sting of tears. I hope so, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. With the implementation of the new anti-bias policies, some corners of the industry responded with skepticism. Editorials appeared questioning whether the measures went too far, citing concerns about pilots' ability to make swift decisions without fear of backlash. Evelyn Carter, now back in the public eye, was featured on a major news program discussing the case and its implications. While the Marshall verdict was important, we must ensure that safety is not compromised. There is a delicate balance between fairness and operational necessity. Kevin watched the broadcast from his living room, noting the careful language. It was clear that even with public support, there would be those pushing against change. He made a mental note to work with Rachel on a piece addressing these concerns, reinforcing the idea that fairness and safety could coexist without compromise. Claire Nguyen reached out again, this time with a proposal. Kevin, there's an organization that's interested in starting a coalition to oversee the implementation of these new policies across various transportation sectors. They want you involved. Kevin felt the exhaustion from the past few months seep into his bones, but pushed it aside. I'm interested, he said, but only if we can ensure it's not just performative. Exactly, Claire said, her tone brightening. We're talking real oversight, independent reviews, and continuous public input. The idea took shape quickly, involving not just lawyers, but activists, psychologists specializing in bias, and representatives from marginalized communities. The goal was clear: make systemic reform a permanent fixture, not just a momentary headline. Months later, Kevin received an email that surprised him. Subject: Update from Charles Bennett. The message was brief but sincere. I wanted you to know I've started working with a nonprofit focused on training programs for airline staff. Your case made me see what I was blind to for so long. Thank you for making me confront that. Charles? Kevin stared at the screen, the weight of the words sinking in. Change was difficult, but here was proof that even those who had been part of the problem could become part of the solution. He replied with a simple message. Thank you for choosing to make a difference. The first annual conference on bias in public safety and transport was held in Washington, D.C., with Kevin invited as the keynote speaker. The ballroom was filled with lawyers, policymakers, activists, and airline executives, all gathered to discuss what had once been a nearly invisible issue. As Kevin stood at the podium, the room hushed. This fight started with a single moment, one person being judged unfairly. But it's grown into a movement that shows the power of accountability and change. We're here today because we recognize that fairness isn't an ideal, it's a necessity, and it's our collective responsibility to ensure it endures. The applause that followed was not just for him, but for everyone who had shared their story, lent their voice, and pushed for change. It was a sound that echoed hope. Kevin's fight for justice had moved beyond the courtroom and the immediate policy changes that followed. A year after the trial, he sat at his office desk, now cluttered with papers from various civil rights cases he'd taken on since the landmark verdict. The Marshall Standard had not only inspired changes in airline protocols, but had influenced policies across public and private sectors, from railway systems to corporate training programs. Reports showed a measurable decrease in complaints related to bias in airlines that adopted the new measures. Kevin read through one report detailing a major airline's progress, including mandatory bias training and the creation of a passenger rights ombudsman. The numbers were encouraging, a testament to what could happen when people refused to stay silent. Rachel visited the office to discuss an upcoming story she was writing, a retrospective on the year following the trial. The changes we've seen are impressive, Kevin, she said, sitting across from him with a tablet in hand. But what's even more powerful are the stories I'm hearing from passengers who now feel safer, respected. Kevin nodded. It's proof that change, even slow, can be real. We just have to keep pushing. One of Kevin's proudest initiatives was launching a mentorship program for young law students interested in civil rights work. The program focused on teaching not just the legal strategies, but the patience and resilience needed to confront deep-seated biases. One afternoon, he met with Alicia Morris, a law student who reminded him of himself. Sharp, passionate, and unwilling to accept the status quo. Alicia had been part of the program for 6 months, and her growth had been remarkable. "You've done well, Alicia," Kevin said, as they reviewed her work on a case involving discriminatory housing practices. "Remember, it's not just about winning. It's about making sure every case, every argument, chips away at what needs to change." Alicia nodded, eyes shining. "You've shown me that, Kevin, and I'm ready to make my voice heard." Kevin felt a warmth spread through him. If he could pass on even a fraction of what he'd learned, then the legacy of his fight would continue in ways that went beyond him. A year after the trial, a commemorative event was held in the city. It was a mix of celebration and reflection, featuring panels, speeches, and discussions about the ongoing work required to keep momentum going. Rachel emceed the event, her voice confident as she introduced speakers and recounted the pivotal moments of the case. Kevin sat in the audience at first, watching as community leaders, lawyers, and even industry insiders spoke about what the Marshall Standard had come to represent: accountability, fairness, and the courage to challenge outdated norms. When it was his turn to take the stage, he stood amidst the applause, the sound washing over him like a wave. "Thank you," he began, eyes scanning the crowd. "A year ago we made a statement. We showed that fighting back against what's wrong can lead to real, lasting change. But I'm here to remind you that this is not the end. Change is a living thing. It requires nurturing, vigilance, and the voices of many to sustain it." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "It's not enough to have won once. We must keep fighting for everyone who still hesitates when they step into a space, wondering if they'll be seen as they are, or as a threat. This is why we're here, and why we'll keep moving forward." The room erupted into applause, but Kevin's focus was on the faces in the crowd, each one a reminder of the stakes and the purpose behind every battle. In the months that followed, Kevin began receiving invitations from corporate leaders seeking advice on how to embed fairness into their practices. It was an unexpected turn, but one that he approached with cautious optimism. Among those who reached out was Captain Charles Bennett, who had kept his promise to work with nonprofits focused on anti-bias training. They met again, this time as collaborators on a panel discussing ethical leadership in high-stakes environments. Bennett spoke candidly about his experiences, the moment that changed him, and how realizing his own biases had been difficult but transformative. "When we're in positions of authority, we have to be more than just decision-makers," Bennett said, glancing at Kevin. "We have to be learners, constantly challenging what we think we know." Kevin nodded in agreement when it was his turn to speak. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, but even more to change because of it." Their exchange was noted by many in the audience. Reported in articles that highlighted the potential for growth and redemption when people are willing to confront their shortcomings. As the conference season wound down, Kevin found himself on a quiet evening walk through the park, reflecting on how far everything had come. The city skyline stood tall and steady, a contrast to the turbulence that had defined the past year. His phone buzzed with a new email. It was from a university dean inviting him to teach a seminar on civil rights and advocacy. The idea appealed to him. Not just fighting in the courtroom, but shaping the next generation to carry the torch. He smiled as he replied with interest, feeling a new chapter unfolding. His fight had started with a single painful moment on an airplane, but it had grown into something much larger, a call for change that resonated beyond his own experience. Months later, Kevin stood in front of a class filled with eager faces. Some of them would go on to become lawyers, others advocate or writers. All of them shared one thing: the belief that change was possible. He told them the story of his fight, not as a tale of triumph, but as a reminder of resilience. Real change doesn't happen overnight, Kevin said, closing the lecture. It's built on small victories and the courage to face what's difficult, even when it feels insurmountable. As he left the classroom, the sunlight spilling into the hallway, Kevin felt lighter. The journey had scarred him, challenged him, and remade him. But it had also shown him the power of standing up, not just for oneself, but for everyone who needed a voice. And in that, he found not just closure, but hope. Kevin's involvement in shaping fair practices grew as new cases reached his desk. Each new challenge was a reminder that the road to lasting change was never straight. Some cases mirrored his own fight, with individuals facing biases in other industries. The Marshall Standard became a guiding principle in boardrooms and courtrooms, influencing policies far beyond aviation. One day, Alicia Morris, his mentee, rushed into his office, eyes wide with excitement. "Kevin, you won't believe this. One of the rail systems just adopted a version of the Marshall Standard. It's already making a difference." Kevin's eyes lit up. "That's incredible, Alicia. It shows that this isn't just an isolated win. It's a template for change." She smiled, her enthusiasm contagious. "They even want to consult with us on how to implement training. I've been asked to help." Pride swelled in Kevin's chest. "Then go show them why they came to the right place. You're ready for this." In the following weeks, Kevin traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with lawmakers and industry leaders at a forum aimed at creating nationwide guidelines for fair treatment across all public services. The event was bustling with attendees: senators, corporate executives, and civil rights leaders, each one adding their voice to the evolving dialogue. During a panel discussion, a congresswoman approached Kevin. "Mr. Marshall, your work has been revolutionary. We're drafting legislation to standardize anti-bias policies across federally funded services. Your input would be invaluable." Kevin's heart thudded with a mix of excitement and responsibility. "I'd be honored to contribute. The goal has always been to make sure fairness isn't just a principle, but a practice." The discussions were long and sometimes contentious, with debates about the extent of oversight and the balance between safety and fairness. But as the days passed, a rough framework took shape, an expansion of the Marshall Standard that would apply to multiple sectors. It was progress, not perfection, but it was a step in the right direction. Trina called one evening with a note of pride in her voice. "Kevin, I was at the community center today, and people are talking about how things are changing. They're using your case as an example of how one voice can start something big." Kevin smiled into the phone. "It's not just me, Trina. It's everyone who stood up and said enough. And don't forget," she added, a teasing note in her voice, "Mom would still tell you to keep pushing." "I know," Kevin said, his heart warming at the thought. "I plan to." The conversation stayed with him as he walked through his neighborhood later that night. The streets were quieter than the city's heart, lined with rows of townhouses that felt like they had seen it all. Families growing, friends laughing, and countless stories of resilience. An invitation arrived in the mail one morning, bearing the seal of a prominent university. Kevin read the embossed text carefully. "We are pleased to invite you to deliver the commencement address for the graduating class." The significance of the moment washed over him. It was a nod not just to his legal accomplishments, but to the influence his story had on inspiring future generations. On the day of the ceremony, the auditorium was packed, buzzing with the excited energy of graduates and their families. Kevin stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of eager faces. These were the young minds that would carry the torch forward, each one capable of sparking change. "When I first stood up for what was right, I didn't know where it would lead," he began. "I only knew that silence was no longer an option. Today, you stand at the start of your own journeys. You'll face choices that test your convictions, moments that demand you speak when it's easier to stay quiet. Choose to speak. Choose to stand. Because change starts with the courage to confront what's wrong and believe in what can be made right." The applause was thunderous, but Kevin's focus was on the connections forming in the room. Conversations sparked, ideas born. Months later, Kevin found himself at the airport, preparing to board a flight for the first time since that fateful day. The terminal buzzed with familiar energy, but this time there was no apprehension, only a quiet sense of resolve. He passed a family laughing together, a businessman tapping out emails, and a flight attendant who smiled at him, genuinely. As he settled into his seat, he felt the presence of the past, a younger version of himself, uncertain but determined. The flight attendant came by, pausing when she recognized him. "Mr. Marshall, I just wanted to say thank you. What you did changed everything for people like me." Kevin smiled, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you. That means a lot." The engines roared to life, and as the plane ascended, Kevin looked out the window, the city below shrinking but never forgotten. He knew the fight for justice was never truly over, but he felt prepared for whatever came next. Change, after all, was a journey, not a destination. If you found Kevin's journey inspiring and want to see more stories that highlight resilience, justice, and the fight for positive change, make sure to subscribe and stay connected. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive and empowers new voices to tell their stories. Subscribe now and join a community that believes in standing up for what's right, one story at a time.